They thought she was lost. They thought she was confused. On a grey Thursday afternoon in Mississauga, Ontario, a property manager named Fletcher Dowd made the kind of mistake that men like him rarely see coming, because men like him have never once been made to answer for it. Corporal Yvonne Abiodun-Clarke was not confused. She was not lost. She was standing in the lobby of the Ridgecrest Estates condominium complex on Hurontario Street, holding a printed copy of a purchase agreement for Unit 1407, a document she had signed 6 weeks earlier, a document that had her name on it, her military service number on it, and her down payment of $47,000 attached to it. She had taken 3 buses and a train to get there. She had worn her civilian clothes, a navy wool coat, dark slacks, sensible flats, because she was not here on duty. She was here as a buyer, as a homeowner, as someone who had earned the right to stand in this lobby. Dowd was the kind of man who had run this building for 11 years and believed that gave him ownership of something it did not. He was tall, pale-faced, with the permanent expression of someone who had just smelled something unpleasant and had decided not to mention it. He came out of his office the moment he saw her at the front desk, which should have been professional. It was not professional. "Can I help you find someone?" he asked. Not hello. Not good afternoon. "Can I help you find someone?" As though Yvonne Abiodun-Clarke could not possibly be there for herself. "I have an appointment," she said. "Unit 1407. Final walkthrough before transfer of ownership on Monday." Dowd looked at her. His eyes went to the folder in her hands, then came back to her face. Something shifted in his expression. Some small internal calculation that he did not bother to conceal. "That unit's not available for viewing today," he said. "I have it confirmed in writing," Yvonne replied, and opened the folder. "Email from your office, 2:30, Thursday the 14th. There must have been a miscommunication. From your office. These things happen." She stood very still. Yvonne Abiodun-Clarke had stood still in a lot of places in her 44 years. In formation at CFB Petawawa, in a field hospital outside Kandahar, in a funeral home in Hamilton, where they buried her father in a casket draped with a Canadian flag. She knew how to be still in a way that was not weakness. It was patience with teeth. "I'd like to speak with the building manager," she said. "I am the building manager." "Then, I'd like to speak with the property owner." Dowd's smile thinned. "The property owner is not available." "Then I'll wait." What happened next was the part that Dowd would spend the rest of his professional life trying to explain away, first to his supervisor, then to a tribunal, and eventually to a journalist whose story would run in the Toronto Star on a Saturday morning in February. Dowd did not walk away. He did not reschedule. He called security. The security officer who appeared from the back corridor was a young man named Terence, barely 22, visibly uncomfortable, already sensing that he had walked into something he did not want to be part of. Dowd pointed at Yvonne as though she were an object that needed relocating. "Please escort this woman out. She's trespassing." Terence looked at the woman. He looked at the folder. He looked at the purchase agreement she was holding open, so that anyone with functioning eyes could read the date, the address, the name. He looked at Dowd. "Sir," Terence said carefully, "she has paperwork." "I didn't ask for your legal opinion," Dowd snapped. "I asked you to do your job." And here is where the story could have gone differently. Here is where it almost did. Because Terence hesitated, a young man who had a rent to pay and a probationary contract and a manager who signed his timesheets. He hesitated for 3 full seconds, which was long enough for Yvonne to notice, and long enough for her to make a decision of her own. She did not raise her voice. She did not demand. She reached into the inside pocket of her navy wool coat and pulled out a second document. Not the purchase agreement, not the email confirmation, but a card. A laminated card with the logo of the Department of National Defence, the Canadian Forces crest, and the words Corporal Yvonne Abiodun-Clarke, Royal Canadian Regiment, Office of the Inspector General, Property Investigations Unit. She set it on the front desk. Not a slam, a placement. The way you set something down when you have all the time in the world and no reason to rush. "I'm going to wait," she said again, while Terence calls his supervisor. Dowd stared at the card. His face was doing something interesting. "That's," he started. "That's my identification," Yvonne said. "You asked who I was, now you know." Terence picked up the phone. The next 14 minutes were the longest of Fletcher Dowd's career, though he did not know that yet. He stood near the front desk, with his arms crossed, radiating the specific energy of a man who believed he had not done anything wrong, and was simply being inconvenienced by someone making a scene. He had said nothing overtly offensive after all. He had not used any words that would show up in a report. He had simply redirected a situation. That was his job. That was what building management was. He had done this before, not often, not deliberately, or so he would tell himself later, but there had been other moments, other people, other folders full of legitimate paperwork that he had found reasons to question. A young couple in January, a man in October, always a missed communication, always a procedural thing, always something that could be explained. What could not be explained was what came through the front door at 2:47 in the afternoon. Her name was Major Felicia O.C. DeParr, and she was Yvonne's superior officer and her sister-in-law, and she had driven from the base at Meaford in a government-issue vehicle because Yvonne had sent one text message, 3 words, lobby, Ridgecrest, now, and Felicia O.C. DeParr had learned 17 years ago that when Yvonne sent a message like that, you drove. Behind Major O.C. DeParr came 2 other women. One was a lawyer named Caroline Tran from the Military Law Center in Ottawa, who had been on a video call with Yvonne for the past 9 minutes and had made one phone call of her own during that time. The other was a housing rights investigator from the Ontario Human Rights Commission, named Brenda Szymanski, who had been following a pattern of complaints against Ridgecrest Estates Property Management Inc. for the better part of 8 months, and who had in her bag a folder of her own that was considerably thicker than anything Dowd had on his desk. Dowd saw them come through the door and said nothing. He was a man who had spent 11 years as the largest presence in this lobby, and for the first time in 11 years, the lobby did not feel like his. Major O.C. DeParr did not break stride. She walked directly to the front desk, stood beside Yvonne, and looked at Dowd with the expression of someone who has documented everything and is simply waiting for the documentation to catch up. Corporal Abiodun-Clarke had a confirmed appointment, the major said. She has a signed purchase agreement. She has a $47,000 payment on record, and she has been standing in this lobby for 16 minutes while you attempted to have her removed. She paused. Do you want to tell me what policy you believe covers that decision? Dowd opened his mouth. Don't, said Caroline Tran, setting her briefcase on the desk with a sound like a door closing. I'd strongly suggest you contact your legal representation before you say anything further. Whatever you say in the next few minutes will be part of a formal record. Brenda Szymanski was already photographing the lobby signage, the front desk, the security camera positions. She had the quiet efficiency of someone who had done this many times and found it neither exciting nor surprising, only necessary. Terence, the security guard, had backed against the far wall. He looked like a man who was mentally rewriting his resume. He would, in fact, submit a written statement to the Human Rights Commission the following week, and it would be thorough, and it would be damaging, because Terence was 22 years old, and he was not willing to carry this for a man who did not know his name. What happened over the next hour was not dramatic, in the way that television dramas are dramatic. There were no raised voices after the first 2 minutes, no confrontation in a hallway, no single moment where the music swells. It was paperwork. It was phone calls. It was a regional director of the property management company, arriving pale and sweating in a grey Audi at 4 o'clock, and speaking to his lawyer in the parking lot for 22 minutes before coming inside. It was Dowd being asked to sit in his own office while other people managed his lobby. It was Yvonne Abiodun-Clarke walking upstairs at 3:15 to do her final walkthrough of Unit 1407, accompanied by Caroline Tran and the building's assistant manager, a quiet woman named Denise, who had by that point apologized to Yvonne twice and meant it both times. The unit was on the 14th floor. The windows faced west, toward the Credit River Valley, and in the late afternoon light, the view was the kind of thing that makes a person understand why they signed a $47,000 check. Yvonne stood at the window for a long moment. Behind her, Caroline was going through the room with a punch list. Denise was making notes on a tablet. Outside, the sun was doing what November suns do in Ontario, going down early, as though apologizing for something. Yvonne thought about the 3 buses and the train. She thought about her father's flag, folded into a triangle, sitting on a shelf in her bedroom in Hamilton. She thought about 22 years of service, 2 overseas deployments, a shrapnel scar on her left forearm that she no longer noticed unless it rained, and the particular kind of fatigue that comes not from danger but from having to prove, again and again, in rooms that should not require proof, that you belong there. She thought about the lobby downstairs and the look on Dowd's face when she placed her ID card on the desk. Not surprise exactly, not shame. Something closer to recalculation. The look of a man realizing that a situation had moved outside the boundaries where his usual tools worked. She thought about Terence, who had hesitated and then called his supervisor and then told the truth. She pressed her hand flat against the window glass, cold on her palm, the river valley below, bare trees, the last of the afternoon. Then she turned around and told Caroline she was satisfied with the walkthrough. The formal complaint filed by the Military Law Centre and the Ontario Human Rights Commission named Fletcher Dowd by name and Ridgecrest Estates Property Management Inc. as a corporate respondent. It cited 3 specific incidents over 14 months in which black buyers or renters had been subjected to procedural delays, unscheduled cancellations, and in 2 cases, direct suggestions that the properties in question were no longer available despite active listings. Dowd's incident with Yvonne was the 4th. It was also the one with the most documentation, the most witnesses, and the most immediate institutional backing. The regional director of the property management company, whose name was Gerald Pfeiffer, and who had spent 22 minutes in the parking lot on the phone with his lawyer, made the decision within 72 hours to place Dowd on administrative leave, pending an internal review. He released a statement. The statement used the words, "does not reflect our values," 4 times in 6 paragraphs, which is the kind of statement that tells you very precisely what kind of values a company actually has. Dowd hired a lawyer. His lawyer negotiated. The process took 4 months, and at the end of it, Dowd was no longer employed by Ridgecrest Estates Property Management Inc. The company settled with the Human Rights Commission. The settlement terms were not disclosed, but Brenda Szymanski, the housing rights investigator, was quoted in the Toronto Star piece as saying that the outcome represented a meaningful consequence, which in the language of institutions is about as close to satisfaction as you usually get. The Toronto Star piece ran on a Saturday. By Sunday afternoon, it had been shared 11,000 times. The comment section, which the Star's moderation team worked through the weekend to manage, included the full spectrum of responses that any story about race and power and Canadian institutions tends to generate. The people who understood immediately, the people who needed it explained, and the people who would never understand because understanding would require them to look at something they had spent their whole lives not looking at. Yvonne did not read the comment section. She had moved into Unit 1407 3 weeks before the piece ran, and on the Saturday it was published, she was assembling a bookshelf in the 2nd bedroom that she was going to use as a home office. Her sister-in-law came over that afternoon with takeout from a Ghanaian place on Dixie Road, and they sat on the floor of the half-furnished living room with their food and the view of the Credit River Valley going dark outside the windows, and they talked about other things. The flag in the triangle frame was on the shelf above the fireplace. It was the first thing she had unpacked. Fletcher Dowd thought he saw a woman who didn't belong. He saw a target where there was none, made an assumption that cost him everything, and never once stopped to ask a simple question. The only question that mattered. What he should have said, standing in that lobby on a grey Thursday in November, was hello. Instead, he said, "Can I help you find someone?" And in doing so, he found out exactly who she was. 22 years of service, 1 signed purchase agreement, $47,000, and a military ID card, placed on a front desk with the patience of someone who has already won and is simply waiting for the room to catch up. That is what accountability looks like in Canada. Not always loud, not always fast, but it comes. If this story stayed with you, hit that like button. It's the simplest way to make sure stories like this keep reaching the people who need to hear them. Subscribe to Sounds of Justice and turn on the bell so you never miss what comes next, and tell us in the comments. Do you think the outcome was enough? Or does meaningful change require something more than a settlement and a statement that doesn't reflect anyone's values? Let us know. We read everyone. I keep thinking about that moment when Yvonne placed her military ID on the front desk. Not threw it, not slapped it, placed it. That one small gesture has stayed with me longer than almost anything else in this story, because it says everything about who she was before anyone in that lobby had the sense to ask. There's a version of this story where Yvonne raises her voice, where she argues, or demands, or lets the anger that any reasonable person would feel in that lobby come out at full volume. And I think most of us would understand that version completely. But that's not what she did. She waited. She was still. She reached into her coat, and she let the truth do what the truth does when you give it enough room. It landed. What strikes me about Fletcher Dowd isn't that he was malicious in some theatrical way. It's that he was careless. He looked at a woman with a purchase agreement and a confirmed appointment and made an instant decision about what she was there for, and then he committed to that decision with the full weight of his position. That's the part that costs people everything. Not the initial mistake, but the commitment to it. He called security rather than asking a single question. He doubled down rather than pausing for 3 seconds to read what was right in front of him. Yvonne had the integrity not to play the scene he was expecting. That kind of self-possession, choosing stillness over reaction, choosing to let the situation unfold on your own terms rather than on someone else's panic, that takes something most people underestimate. It takes a clear understanding of your own worth that doesn't require the room's agreement to stay intact. She had spent 22 years building that. 2 deployments, a shrapnel scar, funerals with folded flags. You don't come through all of that without knowing, in a way that goes past words, exactly who you are. And then there's Terence. 22 years old, on probation, his supervisor pointing at a woman with a legitimate document and expecting him to look past it. He hesitated. 3 seconds. And then he called his supervisor instead of following an order he knew was wrong. I think about Terence a lot, actually, because the easier path was obvious and he didn't take it. That choice, small, quiet, made in a lobby with no cameras pointed at him and no applause waiting. That's the kind of thing that defines a person more than any big moment ever does. What happened to Dowd wasn't bad luck. It was the direct and logical result of treating accountability as optional. The system caught up with him because someone had been patient enough to document it, thorough enough to build a case over 8 months, and willing enough to walk through a door when it mattered. Brenda Szymanski had a folder. Caroline Tran had already made a phone call. Major O.C. Depart drove from Meaford on 3 words. That's what it looks like when people do their jobs with genuine conviction, rather than just enough effort to avoid being blamed. I don't think this story is about one man losing a job. I think it's about what happens when someone has spent so long operating without consequence that they've genuinely forgotten consequence exists. And I think it's about what Yvonne carried into that building, not just her paperwork, but 22 years of knowing that the work matters, that you show up prepared, and that you do not let someone else's carelessness become your defeat. She moved into Unit 1407. The flag went up on the shelf first. That's not a small thing.